Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It is so great to be with you all today. So, as Vicki said, I'm Alicia John-Baptiste, CEO at SPUR. We like to think of ourselves as the Valley Vision of the Bay Area, so that gives you a sense of what we do. And I am going to first figure out how to use this clicker. Let's start there. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what it means to create an equitable future. And we're going to have a couple of interactive points in this keynote presentation. So if you have your phones and you remember how to use that Menti, please have those available. And I'm also going to take a page from the Kaiser Permanente book and ask us to start just by, if you're comfortable closing your eyes, otherwise just taking a soft gaze downward and just take a breath in and a breath out. And now imagine for a moment that you are in a livable community. You are in your ideal future. Imagine what that looks like. Who's with you? What are the attributes of your community? And now imagine what it feels like to be in this ideal, livable place in the future. How do you feel in this place? And now you can open your eyes or look up if they were open already. And I'd like you to just use that Menti. Do we have the Menti? Sorry, I'm looking for the AV team. Do we have the Menti available? Yes? Great. And just answer this question. What does it feel like? I see hopeful, excited, optimistic, safe, at peace. And I ask us to start in this place today because as we're thinking about creating this future, it's really helpful to ground ourselves in the experience of what we hope to achieve. Because there are really two paths to our future. There's a conscious path and there's an unconscious path. And if we want to create a place in which we feel safe and connected and hopeful and happy and joyful and comfortable, it's really helpful to bring intentionality to that. Because when we choose the unconscious path, what we're doing is allowing our status quo to continue us on the trajectory that we are already on. And that might be what we're looking for, but also it might not be what we're looking for. And so as we think about our path forward, I want to start a little bit with our status quo. And we heard some really great insights from Evan earlier. But one of the things that really jumped out to me when I looked at these results was how much similarity there is between the concerns that are being identified in the Sacramento region and the ones people are identifying in the Bay Area. Almost exactly the same. The Bay Area this summer didn't suffer as much from wildfire smoke, or otherwise I think we would have had the exact same 4 concerns listed. The second thing that really jumped out at me about these concerns was how closely they track against Maslow's hierarchy of need, the foundational components of this hierarchy of need. Now you may be asking, who is Maslow? Which is a question I asked when I first learned about this just a few years ago. But Maslow, Abraham Maslow, he was a psychologist. He created a theory of human motivation back in the 1940s. He was what people call a humanist, which basically means that he believed that people are motivated to become their best selves, to live their best lives, to actualize. But that in order to be able to do so, all of us, universally, have some core foundational needs that have to be met. So maybe your dream is to write an amazing children's book. It's really hard to do that when you're hungry. Maybe you want to be an incredible physicist. It's really hard to do that when you are living in your car. So it's an intuitive concept, I think, and probably why it has stuck with me so much. And I think what's so hard about what we are experiencing as challenges today, whether it's in the Sacramento region or next door in the Bay Area, is that at scale, we haven't really figured out how to meet these basic needs for our communities as a whole. So we find ourselves very worried about water. We're not going to have enough water. We don't have clean drinking water. There are communities that do not have clean drinking water. We're very concerned about the quality of our air and the harm that that is causing to us. Many of us do not have enough food on a regular basis. 41% of people are really struggling to keep that roof over their heads, and as many as 20,000 in this region alone have lost shelter altogether. And I hate to re-emphasize this, but we cannot forget the collective trauma that we all lived through in the last 2 years. We will never heal it if we forget it. In the last 2 years, we experienced death. We experienced destruction. We experienced discord. And I think what is missing from Maslow's hierarchy of needs so often is the community. It was really created as a guide to sort of individual development, individual needs, but the well-being of the people around us has a huge impact on our psychological sense of safety and security. So we've talked about, both here in the Sacramento region and in the Bay Area, homelessness being one of our top concerns. The San Francisco Chronicle recently did an incredibly extensive poll where they asked people about this topic and said, what is it that bothers you about homelessness? Is it the experience of interacting with somebody who is not sheltered, or is it how it makes you feel to see the suffering of others? And 2/3 of people said, it's how it makes me feel. This is so, so important. When we witness the suffering of others, we are not okay. We cannot feel safe and secure in the face of the suffering of others. And this is both a challenge and also our strength, because that empathy is what will take us into a new future. The other thing I really want to stress that was also talked about earlier, but the results of these polls, is how racialized the disparities really are. We see extraordinary differences between the Black and the white experience in housing security, in feelings of belonging, even in job satisfaction. I work in the field of public policy. When we see differences that are 16-point differences, 28-point differences, 45-point differences, we start to say to ourselves, what is baked into this system that is producing these results? These are not random results. This is not just, oh, it happened to be a set of people who took this poll and somehow we got these kinds of results. No. These are designed outcomes. These are outcomes that are baked into the DNA of our systems themselves. And I will move off of Maslow in just a second, but there's something important about the hierarchy of need. So many of you may know of a man named John Powell. He runs the Othering and Blogging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the progenitor of the concept of targeted universalism. Really just incredible man. I talked to him in the last couple of years about Maslow's hierarchy. And one of his points was that there are some more recent critiques of that hierarchy of need, pointing out that when we live in a society, and of course we all live in a society, actually the only way that we get our fundamental needs met is to be understood to belong in that society, in that community. When we are not seen as belonging, we are not cared for. When we're not seen as belonging, we are not cared for. So I think it's helpful to look at why we are where we are, because California is actually a very wealthy state, and yet we have so many people struggling to meet basic needs. And also, we know that on aggregate, white people are faring better than are everybody else. So there are a lot of different answers to this question, but I want to just hone in on one component part, which goes back to housing, and I appreciated the panel conversation earlier. So in California, like in the rest of the nation, we used redlining and racial covenants as legal tools of racial discrimination all the way up until 1968, when they were outlawed by the Fair Housing Act. And of course, after that, racial discrimination was practiced in lending and in HOA rules and in social pressures and all kinds of other ways. It's not that it disappeared, but up until about 55 years ago, we were literally creating communities that were explicitly only allowed for white people. People of color were left out of government-sponsored homeownership programs, and oftentimes the places in our communities that were sort of left for people of color were those that were the most environmentally hazardous. After the Fair Housing Act, California passed Proposition 13, and then particularly in the Bay Area, started adopting environmental policies, which meant that we stopped building into our green spaces, but at the same time, didn't build commensurate amounts of housing in our urbanized areas. So our rate of housing production declined over time. For us in the Bay Area, in the last 10 years, our population's grown by about 1 million people, over 700,000 jobs, and we have underbuilt housing units by 700,000 just in the past 10 years. Similar story in Sacramento, smaller population base, but underbuilding housing by about 80,000 units in the past 10 years. And so it's really predictable what happens in this circumstance. When we have demand for an essential resource like housing, and supply does not keep pace, people start to compete. And who wins when people are competing? It's the people who have the money who win. We've had this experience recently where our region has become much wealthier. We've added 625,000 households earning $100,000 or more, at the same time that we lost 300,000 households earning $100,000 or less. Some of those folks moved here, and more recently, particularly with work from home taking root, we have some of the higher earners also moving to the Sacramento region. And in both of our regions, everybody is competing for a place to live. At the same time, given all of the housing policies I described earlier, we have disproportionate rates of home ownership among white people, meaning white people are more likely to own their homes than people of color. What that means in a scarcity environment is that people who have the opportunity to own their home, and this was something that Rashawn was speaking to, are seeing their wealth increase somewhat exponentially because this resource is becoming more and more and more valuable. And while this is happening, we have communities more populated with renters, less invested over time because they were historically redline communities that suddenly become attractive places to live because they are more affordable. And so you have this situation in which many people of color who are living in these communities are suffering from the greatest intensity of displacement pressure in our respective regions. And of course, not everybody who gets displaced becomes homeless, but some people do. And we see extraordinarily disproportionate rates of Black and African American residents among our unsheltered populations. So this is not even looking at kind of the economic opportunity side of the picture, which is also really important. But what I wanted to illustrate with this is that housing insecurity is a designed outcome. The fact that it is worse for our Black and African American residents is a designed outcome. Nothing in these poll results is surprising. It is by design. It is a call to action, but it is not surprising. And I think if you are somebody who is living in Davis or in Sacramento or in Roseville, and you are starting to see Bay Area transplants coming in with tech salaries, and it is starting to make you feel a little uncomfortable and a little bit nervous and a little bit concerned about, is my economic security going to erode in the face of this? That is also not surprising. If we stay on this status quo, where this trajectory will take us is this insecurity is going to reach us all. Okay, taking a breath. And remembering what it was that we wanted, right? What is the future that we are trying to create? Because the good news is, Evan spoke to this earlier with the James Baldwin quote, the good news is, with consciousness, with awareness, we can make different choices. So the question is, how? And I am now going to reveal that I really love triangles and models, but here's another one. This one is called the Water of Systems Change. It's a model of systems change, and I appreciate it because I find systems change to be a really complex endeavor, and this, to me, just really helps to organize kind of the three core components of what we need to be thinking about as we consider how to move ourselves forward. So in the kind of top layer of this model of change is the what. So these are the rules. These are the literal rules that we live by, how our systems are designed. So imagine in the case of redlining that I was speaking to earlier. In that example, this is the actual law that said it is okay to make this a whites-only community. In the second section, you have the who. Who's at the table? Who is making decisions? And who are they connected and responsive to? In the case of redlining, you can imagine that at the time, the people who were passing those laws were white elected officials who were responding to their chosen communities. And then at the bottom, we have the why, the most complex part of it all, because this is our belief system. This is what we understand to be true. It is not facts. It is what we understand to be true. So again, in the case of redlining, you can imagine that the foundational belief was separate and not equal. So that takes us back to Maslow. If the foundational belief with redlining was those people don't belong here, takes us back to this understanding that we only get our needs met when we are understood to belong in the community. So as we move this conversation forward today and together, to me the most essential place to start is with being explicit about what our underlying belief system and value set and vision actually is. And for me, it means placing belonging at the center of our community building efforts and our future building efforts. It is understanding that each of us already has the same intrinsic, inherent value as each of the rest of us. We all already belong. We all deserve to have our basic needs met, whether that's for safety or security or community, full stop. And not just that we deserve to belong. That sounds conditional, but that actually we are stronger. Our communities are more vibrant, more robust, even more prosperous when we all belong. I was reflecting when Sean was talking about 28th and U. If the presumption had been on the part of the lenders, these folks already belong here, how do I filter them in? What result would have been different? Versus, I don't know if these people belong here, let me figure out how to filter them out. So last year in my organization, we published a 50-year vision. It was a big deal. We called it a regional strategy. But I raised this because as we were doing the work to put this together, we started grappling with what are the core things that we actually have to solve for if we want an equitable future, a sustainable future, a prosperous future. What do we actually have to solve for? And it became abundantly clear that the two most important things we needed to keep in mind were questions of how to have the entire community included and how to make sure that we have enough. And we looked at the alternatives to a future in which we have enough and everybody's included. We looked at what if we have enough, but it only applies to some people. And we looked at what if we have a lot of social cohesion, but we actually don't have the resources we need. And then we looked at what if we don't have either of those things? We don't have enough resources and also we're super polarized. And the results are really terrible. They are not the direction that we want to go. And so it takes us back to this question of how do we chart the path forward in which we are solving for the 22% of people who are saying already that they are not feeling that they belong. And I want to just press on this point a little bit, because I think it's easy to say we all belong. I think there are very, very few people in our respective regions who would say, I don't think somebody of that ethnicity or race or religion or orientation background should live in my community. There aren't so many of those folks out there saying that these days. And yet, when we look at the impact of our housing policies, what we see is that communities over and over again are fighting new housing because they don't actually want their communities to change. Oftentimes that comes in the form of fighting against affordable housing and with the presumptions that come along with that. And it's an exclusionary practice. It is not one that would suggest that we all get to belong. And at the same time, I think we also struggle with the other side of this dynamic. And I think about this in the Bay Area, I kind of call it the tech dynamic, where we have many people who've been living in San Francisco or Oakland for a long time, who've watched kind of tech come in and the money that came with it, and got really uncomfortable about it. Started to feel like people are changing the culture of my community, and I don't know how I feel about that, and maybe they shouldn't be here. I could imagine, I don't know if this is true, I could imagine a similar circumstance in the Sacramento region where people are seeing Bay Area transplants coming in and saying, they're kind of changing the fabric of our community, and I don't know if they belong. And what this core principle that we all get to belong requires us to do, whether it is because we're worried that people have more money than us, or we're worried that people have less money than us, whatever it is, we stop and say, not how do I navigate us versus that group over there, the them, but actually how do I expand my circle of concern and my circle of community to understand it to include all of these people? How do we all get to a point where we can feel those sensations of security and safety? And I think that takes us to this really important second level of the triangle, which is, I think, a lot of what we are focused on here today. Because the question comes down to, who are we connected to? How are we defining us and them, right? What are the connection points in our community? And I want to just take a quick pulse, actually, here with this group today, and ask you all just to answer two questions. So the first one, if you don't mind, just rate in terms of the strengths of your relationships with the folks who are in the room today. We'll get just a pulse check on this. So keeping that in mind, seeing where that is now, around a 2.4, let's go to this next question and just evaluate how much, looking around in this room today, each of us feels that we belong in this group. I think these are really interesting metrics to evaluate. Because when we look at, let's say that it landed at, who knows where it actually landed because I moved us off, but let's say it landed at 2.4, how connected are we to each other? Imagine what it would be and what would be possible if you were all the way at a 4 or a 5. What kinds of connections and opportunities and initiatives could be created from this group of people if you all had those strong connections working together? And imagine also that the elected officials and the other policymakers and decision makers who are deciding things on behalf of the community of the Sacramento region on a daily basis, imagine if they understood that when they were talking to one person here, they were actually connected to all of these other people there. What would that change in terms of what is possible? So the last component of this, of course, is the rules that we live by. And to me, this sort of feels like the easiest part, because the rules that we create are a direct outgrowth of what we believe and who we're connected to and who we're trying to solve for. And of course, these matter. In fact, this is where my organization spends literally all of its time. So I have to say that this matters. But I do think that in terms of the hard work that needs to be done to move us onto a different trajectory, it really sits in that question of what is the belief that we are solving for, and who are we doing this work with? And I do recognize that what I have been describing is a little sort of esoteric and can start to feel a little bit overwhelming. And so I wanted to close today just by giving an example of what can happen when we start to think differently and when we start to work together differently. And this is a really recent example. So some of you will know Michael Tubbs. He was the mayor of Stockton. And in 2019, he introduced what I think of as really a very radical concept. He introduced something called guaranteed income. He gave $500 a month to 125 different families in Stockton for 2 years, and then he and collaborators tracked the welfare of those families over that 2-year period of time. And what was so radical about this idea and about this action that he took was the way that it changed how we think about poverty. Because for generations, we as Americans have been taught that poverty is an outcome of moral failure. Poverty is the fault of the poor. And so therefore you cannot trust poor people with money. And that's why we have food stamps. That's why we have very specific targeted programs that say, well, we're gonna give you money, but we don't trust what you're gonna do with it left to your own devices, so you can use it for this, but you can't use it for that. What this program did was say, actually, that's garbage. When you give people the cash that they need, they will make decisions that are in the best interests of themselves and their families, and we need to trust them to do that. And so what we found with this pilot is exactly that. Health outcomes improved, economic outcomes improved. People were able to hold off from taking the second job, to wait a minute to take that better job. So they ended up, at the end of 2 years, in better economic circumstances. Poverty is not the fault of the poor. Poverty is a designed outcome, and it is something that we can change. And what has come from this small Stockton-only pilot is an explosion of other pilots all over the country, where people are saying, you know what? Actually, maybe the solution to poverty is cash. Maybe what you need in order to get out of that bottom scale is a ladder in which the rungs are actually in place. We are having nationwide conversations now about how to make this happen. And this is not, it wasn't a big federal program, and no, it was Michael Tubbs and some funders and some community members coming together and saying, we believe in this community and we are going to try things differently. And that is what happened. That is what can happen. So when I look at all of you today, and I think about what is the scale that's necessary for us to shift the trajectory, to put ourselves on that different path, the scale's right here. You're already in the room. You're already here because you care about your community. You're already here because you want to make those connections. And also, the work can be fun because it's the work of building relationship, building trust, and testing and trying different ways of thinking. When I think about where we have come from, the death, the destruction, the discord, I think about the antidote. I don't think that the antidote to discord is harmony. The antidote is connection. The antidote to destruction is not status quo. It's coming together to build something different. That is how we support life. That is how we create this livable future, our vibrant communities, our equitable path forward. Thank you.